this be a safe place to... Так. Так, кто переведет? Угу. Я приветствую, уважаемые коллеги. Сегодня мы принимаем здесь господина Браудера, и, так сказать, я вместе с господином Браудером хотели сказать несколько слов по поводу планируемых 21 числа выборов в Генеральной Ассамблее Интерпола. Как стало известно и как об этом уже многократно говорилось в различных средствах массовой информации, одним из наиболее вероятных кандидатов является господин Прокопчук, представитель России в Интерполе и бывший руководитель Национального бюро Интерпола в России.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're hosting today here Bill Braudera and his lawyer Ben Emelson. Welcome everyone again, and today we're doing this press conference in regard to the Interpol elections that are scheduled to take place tomorrow on the 21st. The likely candidates, or the most likely candidate to win and become the new president of Interpol is Mr. Prokopchuk, who was for many years the head of the National Bureau of Interpol of Russia, and from 2006 to 2016 has been also working on the international level of Interpol.
Я имею личный опыт взаимодействия с Национальным бюро Интерпола в России в то время, когда его возглавлял господин Прокопчук. Как мы с вами знаем, Интерпол создан для того, чтобы устанавливать местонахождение людей, которых разыскивает полиция той или иной страны.
So I had personal experience with the head of the National Bureau of Interpol, Mr. Prokopchuk, and as you know, Interpol was established to locate people, the criminals, and find where they are and arrest them.
При этом Интерпол не должен выбирать страну, которую было бы выгодно иметь как место судебного разбирательства над конкретным обвиняемым. Интерпол не создан для того, чтобы помогать преследовать политических оппонентов режима. Интерпол не должен заниматься теми делами, где местонахождение человека установлено, и весь вопрос – это судебное разбирательство, если таковое считает нужным сторона его места пребывания.
So Interpol was not established to select a suitable country for persecution. Interpol was not established to persecute people for political motivations, and Interpol was not established to find or locate people where their whereabouts are known.
Тем не менее, я находился в Великобритании. Я объявил публично о своем местонахождении в Великобритании в 2015 году. Я являюсь достаточно известным оппонентом режима. Зная это, Национальное бюро Интерпола под руководством господина Прокопчука не только направило соответствующую заявку в Интерпол, о чем они сообщили, и получили отказ.
In 2015, when the Russian National Bureau of Interpol made a request for international arrest warrant, in my case, the National Bureau of the Russian Federation knew very well where I was located. I was here in Great Britain. Nevertheless, they made a decision to request such a warrant from Interpol. I'm a very well-known opponent of the regime
И я
in
публично
Russia.
объявлял, что я нахожусь в свой адрес.
And I have publicly announced my address in UK where I was located.
Как мы понимаем, получив отказ из Центрального бюро Интерпола, Национальное бюро под руководством господина Прокопчука разослало по требованию Кремля, как опять же я понимаю, двусторонние меморандумы в разные страны, что было явным нарушением устава Интерпола и требованием регулирующих инструкций Интерпола.
And when Interpol refused to issue an international warrant for my arrest, Mr. Prokopchuk, who was at that time the head of the National Bureau of Interpol, nevertheless has issued several notices to individual countries, member states of Interpol, to issue individual arrest warrants in my case.
Естественно, после нашего обращения в Интерпол были разосланы письма о том, что это не является законным. Тем не менее, такие действия были совершены. Я всерьез опасаюсь, что если господин Прокопчук будет избран президентом Интерпола, то по команде Кремля он будет готов совершать абсолютно любые действия, поскольку о своей репутации ему заботиться не приходится.
Despite the fact the International Interpol then reprimanded the National Bureau of the Russian Federation for issuing such illegal requests. Nevertheless, that was done, and I have serious concerns that if Mr. Prokopchuk, who was in charge of previous actions, illegal actions, in his capacity as the national chief of Interpol, will continue to serve in not in the interest of Interpol and justice, but in the interest of people in Kremlin.
Ну, это мой личный опыт, но теперь я передаю слово Браудеру.
So I just wanted to briefly explain my personal experience with Interpol, and now I will pass along the microphone to Bill.
Good afternoon. My name is Bill Browder. For those of you who don't know me, my main activity is to promote something called the Magnitsky Act to different countries around the world. The Magnitsky Act was named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered in Russian police custody 9 years ago after exposing a $230 million tax rebate fraud which benefited senior officials in the Putin regime. Since his murder, I've been an advocate around the world in getting this act passed, and Vladimir Putin has been very active in trying to stop the Magnitsky Act from being passed and to try to go after me in every way possible. And I'd like to share with you today the chronology of Mr. Prokopchuk in Interpol and how that's interacted with my issues with Vladimir Putin. This individual who Russia is proposing to be the president of Interpol became the head of Russia's National Central Bureau of Interpol in 2011. In December of 2012, the U.S. Congress passed the Magnitsky Act and it was signed into law. Vladimir Putin made it his single largest foreign policy priority to have the Magnitsky Act repealed. In retaliation for the U.S. passing the law, Vladimir Putin banned adoption of Russian orphans by American families, and then Vladimir Putin started to go after me. In May of 2013, under the guidance of Mr. Prokopchuk, Russia issued its first Interpol red notice request for me. It was on the Interpol system briefly until we shared the details with Interpol of how Putin had been going after me. And Interpol decided 2 weeks later to reject Russia's red notice request because it was politically motivated and illegitimate. I was then put on trial in absentia in Russia along with Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was the first person in the history of Russia to be put on trial posthumously. We were both found guilty in July of 2013, and then Russia issued another request to Interpol for a red notice. That request was immediately rejected by Interpol as being illegitimate and politically motivated. Russia then applied again in 2014, and that request was rejected in 2015. There were several more requests. The most recent one was after the Canadian Parliament unanimously passed the Canadian Magnitsky Act in October of last year. Within days, Russia issued another illegitimate Interpol arrest warrant request. That request was denied by Interpol as being illegitimate and politically motivated. I was then visiting the most senior anti-corruption prosecutor in Spain in May of this year, where I was giving him evidence on Russian organized crime connected to the Magnitsky case. And about 2 hours before my meeting, a different division of the Spanish authorities came to my hotel and arrested me again on a Russian Interpol arrest warrant. Interpol advised the Spanish police to release me 2 hours later. And then yesterday morning, the Russian government then held a press conference in which they have accused me of murdering Sergei Magnitsky and vowed to issue another Interpol arrest warrant. This will be the seventh request by Russia. Now, all of this has happened under the command of Russia's head of their National Central Bureau, Mr. Prokopchuk. And this individual is now being put up to be the leader of Interpol. And I can't imagine a more inappropriate person than a person who has been the architect of the abuse doled out to me by Russia at Interpol. There is probably no more inappropriate person than this person, and there's no more inappropriate country to have any type of leadership position at Interpol than Russia. Prior to this to this announcement of this of Russia's objective of having him as president, I have started to put together an initiative which I'm going to share with you today, which is that the Interpol Constitution has very specific rules which forbid countries who are serial abusers from using the system. In my case, Russia has been a serial abuser. In the case of Mihail Ходорковский, they've been a serial abuser. In the case of many of his associates, they've been a serial abuser. In the case of supporters of Alexei Navalny, they've been a serial abuser. And so we intend to begin a legal process to have Russia suspended from their use of Interpol. And Ben Emerson is a very famous QC here in the UK, human rights lawyer, former UN rapporteur, and I will let him say a few words about our initiative to have Russia suspended from using Interpol.
Thank you, Bill. As Bill says, my name is Ben Emerson. I'm an international lawyer based here in London, but practicing, amongst other things, in the area of mutual legal assistance between states, of which Interpol is a key part. Article 3 of the Interpol Constitution is absolutely explicit in its complete prohibition against Interpol engaging in any way in the furtherance of the political objectives of one of its signatory states. But we know, not just in the case of Russia, but in the case of other authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, there is systematic evidence of abusive use of the Interpol process in order to pursue those who are perceived to represent a political threat to the government in question. The challenge for Interpol has always been this, that like other international institutions of law enforcement, it was set up on the basis of an understanding of trust. The concept in legal terms is called the Comity of Nations. Countries believe one another in principle and expect one another to behave in good conscience, in good faith, and to use international legal procedures in the way that in democracies we would expect governments to use domestic legal procedures. As a result, the sort of safeguards that you would expect to find against abuse in a system as powerful as this are simply not there. There is an almost complete absence of due process in the Interpol system. It's true that there are cases, and the case of Mihail Ходорковский and Bill Browder are examples, where the abuse is so obvious and so obviously political that even the Interpol Commission has found it impossible to turn a blind eye. But there are many, many more cases, and I represent a number of individuals in this position, where it is perfectly obvious that the motivation behind the Interpol red notice, or the diffusion as it's called, which is a rather lower standard than an absolute red notice, but nonetheless easier to achieve, where they have been plainly motivated by political motives and tainted, corrupt prosecution policies. I say that's the position with a number of particular states. It is, but it's undoubtedly the case that Russia is amongst the chief offenders in this regard. And therefore we are faced with a crisis. Such a crisis, in fact, that next week a gathering of very senior security policy officials in the United States is meeting at a public meeting in Washington to discuss Russian abuse of Interpol under the heading of a critical security threat to the United States. The situation is becoming acute partly because there has been a dramatic and exponential rise in the number of applications for diffusions and red notices. You'll see some of the statistics quite carefully set out in Michael Peel's article in the Financial Times yesterday. And what was and has been an open secret amongst lawyers and practitioners in this field for several years has now burst into the open as a crisis. And the timing is to some extent extraordinary because it happens just at the very moment when a Russian national is up for election as president of Interpol. And it happens on the very day after Bill Browder it finds himself facing yet another set of abusive charges from Russia, including the absurdist proposition that he was somehow implicated in the murder of his own lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. If one needed a totem for the political nature of the abuse of this system, that decision announced yesterday is plainly it. Nothing further needs to really be said in order to understand the depths to which those using this system are prepared to sink in order to take machinery which exists, quite rightly exists, for the promotion of cooperation between police forces with a view to tracking down and prosecuting criminals. And much of the work that Interpol does is extremely valuable. But in this particular sphere, it has an extremely weak underbelly with no real protection against manipulation and abuse. So I was asked earlier this year by a number of international interests and clients to look at the picture as a whole, to move beyond looking at individual instances of abuse, but to put together the overall picture in order to be able to see how one particular state has manoeuvred in order to suborn the Interpol system. At that stage, it was not, in fact, a live possibility that a Russian national who had been involved in that process would end up as president of Interpol. At least it wasn't at the forefront of the public agenda. But that, in a sense, underlines the urgency of the situation. There are really three stages of potential response at the Interpol level. The first, which seems most unlikely if this election goes ahead in the way that it's anticipated, is that the rules themselves require the Interpol Commission to consider the track record of the NCB, the National Criminal Bureau, which is applying to use its diffusion system. And once it has become clear that a particular state's NCB has engaged in repeated politically abusive applications, then in principle that is the basis for Interpol to take the view that a presumption at least should operate in cases where there's doubt about the charges, that they do not lend themselves to being a part of a political process. The next step up, and this is the target of the campaign of work that Bill's referred to, is that the Interpol rules allow for the access of a member state to be suspended or withdrawn where there is clear evidence of repeated abuse. And I can say this to you, that having reviewed the material, and not just in relation to Russia but other states too, I am certainly clear in my mind that so far as Russia is concerned, the threshold necessary for the activation of that suspension or withdrawal provision is plainly and very clearly crossed by some considerable distance. So the question is, why, given that that is known, has no action been taken by Interpol up until now? And then the third level of response, and it's one which is now being called for by important opinion formers in the United States, and we'll see how the debate develops over the next week, it is asking the question whether Interpol is now moved beyond the point at which it can be sensibly reformed, and whether democratic nations need to consider the formation of a new organisation, so that the shared democratic values of commitment to the rule of law can be reflected in the organisation's due process principles. Because if you get into an information exchange with people you cannot trust and who you know have abused the system in the past, the question arises, can the system be fixed with that existing membership? I think one of the great misunderstandings about Interpol, certainly in some parts of the world, is the belief that it represents an international police force. That's to some extent understandable given the name. It does nothing of the kind. It's a clearinghouse. It is an information processing platform which enables one state's police authorities to communicate via Interpol either to other states in particular or to states in general, either an arrest warrant and red notice or a diffusion. It's a clearinghouse in that sense, and so is rather like Reuters or one of the press agencies in the sense that it receives information and passes it out to its users. But unlike Reuters and others and Associated Press, it's not very good at fact-checking. And I think perhaps the closest analogy is to imagine it as a sort of Wikipedia, where you have no idea who is making the allegations or who is amending the text, and you wouldn't place any kind of serious reliance on the content. You might use it as an approximate guide, but you wouldn't place any kind of reliance when you're acting to the prejudice of individuals' rights and responsibilities. If you look at the Interpol Constitution, the mechanisms are there by which it could put its house in order, but it has been aware for a very long time, as have most of those who operate in this legal environment, of this pattern of systematic abuse, and it has failed to put its house in order. Worse still, we now face the prospect of an election in which one of the principal offenders for abusing the system has, or that is to say Russia, has one of its own nationals in the presidency. This has to call into question the future of Interpol. Thank you.
Okay, so the questions. We are live streaming today, so if you could please state who you are and your affiliation. And let's start with the back, please. Sorry, I don't know a lot of people here, so.
Hello, Dan Rivers from ITV News. If this election goes ahead, do you think Interpol will remain fit for purpose?
You want to? Well, let me say that if a Russian is in charge of Interpol, then the West will have to look for a plan B, and the plan B will either have to be creating such a strict set of rules at Interpol that the abuses can't continue to happen, or if that's not possible, then as Ben Emerson was saying, and I've seen a lot of noises over the last few days from politicians that it may be time to create an international law enforcement body that just consists of countries that abide by the rule of law. This is a true moment where if a Russian national becomes president of Interpol, it will degrade the institution to a point where it probably will have to be fixed or changed.
Yeah, you probably to some extent answered this question already. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, by the way. It's well known, it's been known for years, that a slew of countries have permeated the red notice system and abused it. You've outlined that very clearly. One's tempted to ask, why pick on Russia? I mean, your problem, it seems, is with this organisation, not so much Russia, right?
Why don't you go for it?
It's certainly true that there are other states that have abused the system. But the abuse from Russia is on a unique and industrial scale. It is purposive, it is a systemic problem in the relationship between the Russian criminal authorities and Interpol that means that in almost every case, a conscientious and objective judicial system would be highly skeptical about any Russian application. And that's not to say, and I want to make this absolutely clear, that there aren't entirely legitimate functions performed by Interpol. It does extremely good work, for example, in tracing the perpetration of child sexual offences. I mean, that is one of its great success stories. And undoubtedly it's the case, and one can find examples of it, in which straightforward criminal allegations of murder or drug trafficking, where there's very little question mark about political involvement, are properly and have been properly processed by Interpol. The problem is, as far as Russia is concerned, and I would say other states too, particularly as it happens states from the former Soviet Union region, that there is a systemic problem about respect for the rule of law. And that's not just an abstract phrase, it's a genuine belief that courts are not there to stand as a bulwark between the individual and the state, but are there simply as an instrument of state policy. And so the whole system becomes essentially an instrument of state policy. Well, when an international organisation which furthers law enforcement becomes an instrument of one state's policy, one has a very real problem with the organisation. And I think one of the great tragedies about this is it's not possible to answer the question in a simple yes or no, is it fit for purpose? Because in some respects Interpol is more than fit for purpose, it's doing extremely valuable and important work. And that in a sense is the tragedy of the situation, because the extent and scale of the abuse is such that the organisation's valuable work is threatened by its complete inability to protect itself and therefore other states and the people who are the subject of these applications from straightforward political abuse and manipulation, forged, trumped up charges of the kind that we've seen in the Navalny case, of the kind that we've seen in the cases of Mr. Ходорковский and Mr. Browder, the consequences of which are to undermine the system as a whole.
Donnie Tsakurka from the Associated Press, that non-fact-checking organization. Mr. Browder, could I ask you, do you fear that you will be unable to carry out your work should this go forward? You know, your work requires you to travel to other countries. Do you feel like anytime you cross a border, you'll be subject to this? And also, can I also ask an additional question? You know, there's been a lot of discussion about bringing Russia into other international organizations. Why do you think that that is not a good idea in this case?
So the answer is that I have to be careful, with or without Interpol, I've got to be careful where I travel to. I only travel to what I describe as rule of law countries. Those are countries where the court system will protect me from being sent back to Russia to be tortured and killed. And that's a pretty small list of countries. Having said that, if a Russian becomes president of Interpol, and they've made it very explicit, and in the last couple of days, that they're going to use all of their efforts to grab me, it means that there's a pretty good chance that even after 7 abusive attempts, that they will finally be able to get a red notice for me. And so I will have to be more careful about traveling, which is Vladimir Putin's exact objective. He wants to stop me from advocating for Magnitsky Acts around the world. Vladimir Putin, I believe, to be the richest man in the world. He's got a lot of money stashed in a lot of countries, and he hates the Magnitsky Act because the Magnitsky Act potentially puts all of his illicit fortune at risk. And I've been a very effective advocate. There are 6 countries that now have Magnitsky Acts in place: the United States, Canada, UK, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Today, in The Hague, the Dutch government is putting a formal proposal together for an EU-wide Magnitsky Act, which explains the timing of yesterday's charges against me. And if I can't travel to countries to advocate, then it makes it easier for Vladimir Putin to succeed in stopping me.
Сейчас еще. И я хотел бы обратить внимание, что если таким известным людям и, в общем, имеющим деньги на адвокатов, как я и господин Билл Браудер, это представляет не самую большую проблему, то...
For people like myself, like Mr. Browder, who have some money, this is not the greatest of problems.
Мы имеем возможность обратиться к адвокатам, я сказал, и, так сказать, мы достаточно известны.
We can approach lawyers, and we are relatively well known.
Но существует огромное количество менее известных оппонентов режима, и для них эти вот уведомления национальных бюро, которые так любил рассылать господин Прокопчук в свою бытность, это большая проблема, реальная проблема.
There are very many people for who getting the notices from the national bureaus, which in his time Mr. Prokopchuk was so fond of sending around, they might become a real problem.
Mr. Browder, Brendan Cole, Newsweek. You had significant support with the Magnitsky Act. What kind of support do you anticipate coming from the United States with this move to try to lobby against the appointment and also call for reform for Interpol? And just on a personal level, what dimension do you think will the Kremlin's pursuit of you take should Prokopchuk be appointed this week?
From what I understand, there is wholehearted support in the U.S. government and other governments in Europe not to have this individual from Russia made president of Interpol. The way that I understand the issue, though, is that every country has a vote, and that vote is equal. And so the United States vote is equal to the vote of Tajikistan. And there are 192 members of Interpol, and I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but I would imagine that the lobbying that Russia is doing is very similar to the lobbying that they were doing when they created all this illegitimate victories in getting the World Cup located in Moscow through FIFA, through the cheating that they did at the International Olympic Committee and other places. And so Russia loves these international organizations where they can cheat behind the scenes, and I can't imagine it would be any different in this particular election. And they have made it very clear, after my Madrid arrest and my release, it was a big humiliation for Russia. It was a big humiliation for Putin. And the general prosecutor of Russia, Yuri Chaika, gave a press conference a few weeks later, and he said, we are going to redouble our efforts to get Bill Browder. He shouldn't sleep peacefully at night. And now all of a sudden we have his protege, an extension of him becoming the president of Interpol. I can imagine that I will be their single top priority.
Reuters news agency.
Reuters, never been compared to Interpol before, but thanks very much. I just wanted to ask Mikhail Borisovich and Bill Browder if you could explain to somebody stupid like me what the election of this gentleman from the Interior Ministry would mean. Are you basically saying that Putin would have the keys to Interpol? And the second question, I'm slightly confused. You're sitting here and you're obviously very upset about this potential development. What are you actually doing? So is there some sort of challenge that's going to make Interpol do something, or are we just sitting here moaning? Thanks very much.
You want to go first? Well, I would hardly call it moaning. There is until Friday afternoon, I wasn't even aware that this election was taking place. I was alerted to it by Jago Russell, the head of Fair Trials International, who runs an organization that specializes in fighting Interpol abuse and reforming Interpol. And so I think that they were hoping, the Russians were hoping to do this all behind closed doors and to have it become a fait accompli. The fact that we're here in this room and there are 20 cameras that I can identify means that this issue, if Russia was trying to sweep this under the rug and get it done in secret, it's not going to happen anymore. And any politician in any civilized rule of law country is not going to want it to happen anymore. And I've been in touch with members of parliament here, members of parliament in Europe, members of Congress in the United States, and there's an active effort going on to try to stop this from happening. So it's absolutely the fact that everybody is here reporting on it is a very good sign that perhaps it won't happen. What does it mean for the president of Interpol to be a Russian? The presidency of Interpol is not an executive position, it's sort of an oversight position. There is somebody called the General Secretary of Interpol. The current General Secretary of Interpol is a man named Jürgen Stock. He's German. He's a highly respected and professional man who has run Interpol as best as he could, given all these pressures. But that doesn't mean that the president of Interpol basically guides the strategic direction of the organization. And if you have a Russian guiding the strategic direction of the organization towards the direction that Putin wants, that is a very bad sign and something that no rule of law loving person in the world should want to have happen.
Всерьез опасаюсь, что во главе, пускай формально во главе организации, обладающей огромным информационным ресурсом, станет представитель Кремля.
I'm seriously worried about the fact that the head, well, okay, a formal head, but still the head of an international organization with a huge information information resource, that the head of this organization will be a representative of the Kremlin.
Это человек, который совершал действия, признанные, ну, скажем так, не соответствующими правилам Интерпола в то время, когда он был руководителем Национального бюро.
This person has committed actions that would not comply with the norms of the Interpol, even when he was head of the National Bureau.
И у меня есть убежденность, что он, как и другие представители Кремля, абсолютно безразличен к своей репутации, и, соответственно, что он может сделать, это только Господь может себе представить.
And I'm absolutely convinced that, like other representatives of the Kremlin, this is the person completely indifferent to his own reputation. And that's why what he could potentially do, perhaps God can imagine.
То, что мы будем делать, у нас есть правозащитное подразделение нашей организации, и мы, естественно, в случае его избрания будем стараться помогать тем людям, которые подвергнутся преследованию.
What we are going to do, well, I can say that we have a human rights arm of our organization, and we'll try to help the people who are going to be persecuted.
Danielle Hamamjian, CTV Canadian Television. Mr. Browder, two questions for you. How will a Russian individual at the helm of Interpol make it easier for Russia to get you arrested and flown back to Russia? Number two is, what is it about this organization that has allowed it to get to this point? Is it extreme mismanagement? Is it corruption? What is it?
The organization is an international organization like the United Nations. How is it that Saudi Arabia became head of the Women's Rights Commission of the UN? It's the same type of thing, where every country has an equal right, an equal vote, and equal say. you have 192 countries, and Russia and many other authoritarian dictatorships have that. And the assumption is that everyone's going to behave in good faith, and they don't. Russia doesn't behave in good faith, and many other countries don't behave in good faith. If a Russian is president of this organization, this Russian will be acting on the instructions of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is a well-acknowledged criminal. It was his government that organized a terrorist attack in the UK using chemical weapons in Salisbury. It was his government that shot down MH17, killing 298 innocent individuals. It's his government that cheated and hacked in elections in the United States and Europe. And to put his representative in charge of the most important international crime-fighting organization is like putting the mafia in charge, and that will only lead to bad things going forward for crime-fighting and victims of the Putin regime.
Ben Mueller from the New York Times. It was only a few weeks ago that Interpol responded fairly tepidly to the arrest of its president by China. What message do you think it sends about Interpol's relationship with authoritarian governments that it would potentially elect a Russian as its next chief?
You want to take this or? No. Okay, so I think everyone needs to understand what Interpol is. Interpol is a club in which governments are members. The governments are the ones who pay the dues, and so the organization is beholden to the governments that pay the dues. Some of those governments are good governments that have democracies, that have rule of law, that respect human rights, and some of those governments are governments that are dictatorships and authoritarian regimes that don't respect any of those. And they view each person or each organization, each government that's a member, as their client, and it's not us, but the governments. And in this particular case, where a Chinese head of Interpol disappeared, they're beholden to China, not to the person who is their president.
Pierre Briançon from Dow Jones. Considering precisely that the previous president of Interpol was Chinese, and China is hardly a beacon of human rights, did you note that he made things worse than they are? I understand the institutional problem at Interpol. I understand the political symbolism problem. What I don't quite get is whether you really fear that in reality a Russian president will make things worse for you, for example, for Mr. Ходорковский or others who have been victim of the Interpol flaws you outlined.
You want to talk about the Chinese president? You want to talk about the Chinese president?
The short answer to that question is that we are, in any event, leaving aside the election in Interpol entirely, we are already reaching a situation of critical mass in terms of the abuse of the Interpol system by Russia. There are other states implicated as well, of course, but the focus of this systematic abuse is the Russian Federation. Now, at a time when the right course for Interpol to be taking is one of heightened scepticism towards Russian applications for diffusions and red notices, if not suspension or withdrawal of access because of the extent of the abuse. Instead, what we are facing is a situation where there is a potential for a Russian to be elected as the president. Now, common sense dictates that it presages no real possibility of internal reform, because internal reform would need to focus on that particular pattern of abuse and do something about it. And so, I mean, you're making a perfectly reasonable distinction between executive authority of the president, or the executive authority resting in Jürgen Stock, and the role of the president. But the real question here, given that if you look at the statistics, we are at a situation of crisis with Interpol's operations already, for which the primary responsibility rests in its lack of internal due process to safeguard itself against abuse. And yet the principal culprit state for the abuse and suborning of international mechanisms through Interpol is now taking control over the leadership. It's hard to imagine that under those circumstances a reform agenda, which is urgently and critically required if this organisation is to be fit for purpose going forwards, it's hard to imagine that this type of election is going to contribute to such an outcome. I mean, it's time, frankly, that those who support, as I do, international cooperation in law enforcement woke up to the reality that we cannot cooperate internationally with states that do not play by the same rules. And Bill Browder said perhaps the time has come for an organisation of full cooperation between states that respect the rule of law. But I mean, that proposition in itself ought to cause pause for thought, because what it is recognising, even the fact that we're talking about that as a question, is that democratic nation states which cherish the rule of law and the principles of judicial independence and the safeguards and checks and balances that exist in a democracy to protect individuals but also to protect the integrity of the process, are doing business with no protection and no due process and inadequate objectivity through a supine organisation, the object of which is to further the interests of any state that chooses to use its facilities. That cannot be right. That's the short answer.
Thank you. It's Ben Ferguson from Vice News on HBO. Russia already has quite an influential role in Interpol. It's got a national on its Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files, which has the power to throw out red notice requests. Just, you might feel like you've answered this already, but what actual difference would it make if a Russian becomes the president? That's the first question. And if Prokopchuk does become president, Mr. Browder, would you feel less comfortable going to the United States, for example?
I don't need that. I feel totally comfortable going to the United States. The United States has fully rejected all of Russia's illegal and politically motivated attacks against me.
So then what difference would it make if Prokopchuk does become president?
Well, if he becomes president, for me, it would make a big difference, because as I mentioned, Russia has applied 6 times to put me on the Interpol system. And when you're on the Interpol system, just so everybody understands, if there is a red notice for you at any border you cross, the guy at the border check sees your passport, sees there's a red notice, and arrests you. That's what happens. Now, if I'm arrested in a rule of law country, I'll probably be released. But sometimes, in Spain, it took 2 hours to be released. If a country went through the full process, it could take 6 months to be released. And if in some horrible situation, I find some judge who doesn't look at all the facts, and I get sent back to Russia, I'll be killed. And so, I don't want that. And as Mikhail said before, everybody knows us. We can hire lawyers. We can, I've written a book called Red Notice. But for every one of me where there's a big story out there, there's hundreds of small activists, opposition politicians, lawyers, human rights lawyers, and others who don't have that benefit, who will be arrested on a Russian red notice and will have their lives destroyed. And this is a perfect way for Putin to basically breathe the fear of God into all of his enemies, so that they know that they can't even escape Russia if one of his guys is at the head of Interpol.
Приведу пример.
I would like to give you an example.
По моему делу Интерпол вынес решение, что они не будут им заниматься.
As far as my own case is concerned, the Interpol has made the decision that they were not going to get involved into it.
Тем не менее, я был на пересадке в Копенгагене.
But I was changing planes in Copenhagen.
Да? И на границе, при проходе в транзитную зону, офицер говорит: я вас вижу у себя в компьютере.
And at the border, when I was passing through the transit zone, the officer just looks at me and says, "Oh, I can see you in my computer."
Причем офицер говорит: я знаю вас лично, я знаю ваше дело.
The officer says, "I know you personally and I know of your case."
Вот, но у меня в компьютере, поэтому посидите, подождите, я сейчас буду связываться.
But I can see you in my computer, so please just sit and wait here. I'll try to get in touch with the superiors.
Они связывались с Интерполом. Слава богу, в то время господин Прокопчук не был в Центральном бюро.
They got in touch with the Interpol. Thank God at that time Mr. Prokopchuk was not in the Central Bureau.
Я потерял 2 часа, взял билеты на другой рейс и все-таки улетел.
I lost 2 hours. I had to take tickets for another plane, and I did leave the place after all.
Но юристы говорят, что если бы меня не знали лично, если бы при этом не было такого спокойного созвона с Центральным бюро Интерпола, то ситуация могла бы просто гораздо жестче выглядеть.
My lawyers say that if the officer had not known me personally, if this call to the Central Bureau of Interpol did not go so calmly, the situation could have looked very, very differently.
AFP News Agency. I'm sorry if we're all asking the same question, but if you take out the politics, the symbolism, everything else out of it, looking at the facts, what specifically would Russia be able to do with this man as president that it cannot do right now? That's number one. And number two, do you know any actual personal details about the biography of this guy, besides the fact that he headed this agency?
Конкретно об этом человеке, это второй вопрос. И первый, может ли, что они такого смогут сделать, чего они могут сделать сейчас?
Мы раздали бумаги, там есть сведения об этом человеке.
In these papers that we've handed out, you will find some information about this person.
Can I just take that question again head on? The issue is not, and I appreciate today is an important day in terms of the chronology because the election of the president is tomorrow, but the issue is not hinge on the identity of an individual. The problem with Interpol's abuse by Russia is systemic. It comes from two things. Bad faith of the Russian prosecuting authorities, which is a systemic, repeated and inexorable problem, and lack of adequate safeguards in Interpol to eliminate that risk. Now, why is it a crisis now when it hasn't been reached crisis level before? The answer to that is in the statistics. Just look at the statistics on the rise of the use of Interpol red notices and diffusions emanating largely from former Soviet Union countries over the last 2 years. So what has been an individual or a collection of individual injustices, some of which got put right, some of which didn't, has coalesced into an international crisis for an international organisation. It just so happens that at that time, the Russian Federation is putting forward a candidate to take over leadership of the organisation, which, if it goes through, is the clearest possible signal that the organisation will not be taking steps to tackle the crisis that it is facing. So it's not a question about, I mean, nobody here is in a position to make an allegation that an individual appointed to a role is going to do X, Y, and Z, and as a result, the following consequences are going to apply. That's not the point. The point is there are repeated, multiple cases of abuse which Interpol has failed to adequately stem, and the market, the market demand from Russian authorities and other authorities from the former Soviet Union for the use of the sloppy process that Interpol puts at their disposal has risen exponentially. Now, if that is to be stopped, somebody needs to be in charge who is prepared to square up to the threat of abuse and undermining of the rule of law and do something about it. Does this election suggest that that's going to happen to you? I mean, to you, does it suggest that? That's the real issue.
Anna Elisieva for Izvestia, Russia. Mr. Brauder, could you please comment on the accusations, yesterday's accusations by Russian prosecutors that you orchestrated the murder of 4 people and the poisoning of some of them? Thank you.
The Russian government accused me of a number of crimes, and most significantly, they accused me of killing Sergei Magnitsky. And it's a very significant allegation because for 9 years, the Russian authorities and Vladimir Putin have stubbornly claimed that Sergei Magnitsky had died of natural causes. They said that he died of natural causes, that he had not been beaten, and that he had received all medical care that he needed in prison. That's just not true, and the facts there's a mountain of evidence that Sergei Magnitsky was beaten. He was beaten by 8 riot guards with rubber batons on the night of November 16, 2009. There was protocols of the people who beat him saying that they beat him. There's autopsy photographs of Sergei Magnitsky's body with bruises all over his body. There's an autopsy which says that he suffered cranial injuries. And then there's a whole history of Sergei Magnitsky being denied medical care by judges, by the investigators, and by the prison authorities over a long period of time leading up to the last night of his life. The Russian President's Human Rights Commission confirmed that Sergei Magnitsky had been denied his right to life, that he was tortured, and that he was beaten. This is all a matter of fact. And then the Russian government for 9 years pretends that Sergei Magnitsky died of natural causes. And then on the day that the EU is putting forth their EU Magnitsky Act, after all of their attempts to go after me have failed, they come up with this unbelievable, ludicrous, crazy allegation that I had something to do with Sergei Magnitsky's death. It speaks for itself.
Вот такие очевидно фантастические обвинения, как в данном случае, показывают, что, к глубокому сожалению, нашим российским правоохранительным органам наплевать на их собственную репутацию.
I would like to attract your attention.
I would like to attract your attention to the fact that these absolutely fantastic stories like this one just show that our law enforcement agencies are completely indifferent. They completely do not care about their own reputation.
И, к глубокому сожалению, меня на самом деле очень пугают люди, которым наплевать на их репутацию.
And I must say that I'm really scared of people who do not care about their own reputation. I find it very regretfully that that's the way they behave.
Сегодня они пишут фантастическое обвинение против Билла Браудера. Завтра они отдают адреса людей, находящихся под защитой, тем людям, которым они мешают.
Today they are leveling these absolutely fantastic accusations against Bill Browder. Tomorrow they will give the addresses of the people who are under protection to those who would like to get rid of them.
Thank you very much. Oh, last one? Okay, last one.
Stephanie Genzu from CBC. I just want to ask something a little different, looking ahead a little bit to Mr. Ходорковский. Bill, you mentioned the international support, but there's so many other issues out there. And coming up in a couple of weeks, you're going to see Mr. Trump sit down with Mr. Putin at the G20. That's widely expected. I'm wondering what you think of the dynamic between the two men will be and what you expect from that meeting.
Я многократно слышал, что господин Трамп хотел бы улучшить взаимоотношения с Кремлем.
I've heard so many times that Mr. Trump would like his relations with the Kremlin to improve.
Вот, но моя личная точка зрения, что Кремль не даст ему этой возможности.
But my personal point of view is that the Kremlin would never allow him that. They would not give him this chance.
Ну и главное, надо помнить, что для Кремля Америка важна всегда как враг, а господин Трамп лучше всего, чтобы был как можно более слабым.
Also, it's very important to remember that for the Kremlin, America is best seen as an enemy. And the president of America, like Mr. Trump, is best when he is at his weakest.
Это желание Кремля, но, конечно, это не желание российского общества. Но, тем не менее, разговор идет именно о Кремле.
This is, of course, the wish of the Kremlin, not of Russian society, but we're now talking about the Kremlin.
Thank you very much again. Later. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks.
Не дали.